Hello all, I am very excited to share with you this presentation on my final capstone project for the Masters in Applied Exercise Science at Concordia University Chicago. My capstone was on motor learning and sport pedagogy. Here's the agenda for this presentation, and a quick note, I will do my best to respect your time and keep this presentation succinct, but this is a very large research area. It's a vast subject, and so it's very difficult to keep any presentation short. It's impossible to cover everything, but anything too short is just simply not going to be able to cover all of this subject matter. So my specific project was the design of curriculum for a 16-week college level course entitled Motor Learning and Sport Pedagogy. This would be a course targeted at either graduate level students or advanced undergraduate level students. And the focus of this course is the theory, research, and practical implications of motor skill acquisition, motor skill development, and coaching science and coaching theory. Some of the fundamental questions for this project were: how do human beings develop motor skills? And what are the best practices for coaching and practice design to encourage the development of motor skills and also to encourage an optimal practice environment in general? And it's important to understand that with these kind of questions, we can come at them from a variety of different levels of inquiry. We can go as small as the neurophysiological bases of skill acquisition, and we can go really, really broad and look at a variety of sociocultural influences on skill acquisition and skill expression. So these are some of the levels of inquiry from the class that are presented here. There's interpersonal, that would fall into things like coaching, social psychology and the influence of watching other people, observing other people on skill development, or social comparisons in skill development. There's some very interesting work on historical developments and how skill acquisition practices have changed over time and how that sometimes reflects broader societal trends. There's a very interesting emerging framework of an ecological anthropological view of skill development, and this specifically looks at the ways in which non-industrialized societies and early human societies develop skills and how people go about developing skills, and it is often through play and experimentation in those kind of societies. We also look somewhat at youth sport policy, national sport policy, as well as teacher preparation programs for PE teachers and continuing education for coaches. Some of the deliverables for this project included a course description and learning objectives, grading rubrics, a vast reading list. I spent a large portion of this project simply absorbing the research and theory in various books and articles in this space. A course calendar, outlines for lectures, weekly reading quizzes, as well as answers for those, a variety of different assignments, and a midterm and final exam. So when looking at motor learning theory, it's important to understand that there are two broad theoretical frameworks through which motor learning is understood. The first is information processing. That is a more dominant historical framework. And then one which is emerging is ecological dynamics. And I will tell you up front that while I think that they can be complementary and both of them have their pros and cons, I tend to subscribe more to an ecological dynamics view of skill. And I think that that is a more useful way for those of us who actually work with athletes to think about skill. So to start, information processing theory. In this framework, an organism is essentially understood as a form of computer which can build, store, and execute motor programs via the central nervous system. And two of the ways in which this has been broken down are into closed loop motor programs, where essentially, if you think about how an HVAC system works, there are the effectors, the things which actually cool down and heat the house, that they are given instructions by some sort of computer chip which tells them to set it to 70 degrees. Then there is also something that observes, that gives feedback whether or not the temperature is at, say, 72. That would give feedback back to that central processor, which would then say, okay, we need to turn up the AC. So that's closed loop motor theory, and that is also understood for how we modify skills depending on whether or not, or modify movements depending on whether or not they are accomplishing their goal. And then there is open loop motor theory, which tends to emphasize more ballistic and rapid motions, in which it is simply a stored motor program is simply executed without feedback. Now, there are a few problems with information processing theory that are important to understand. The first is the storage problem. If we assume that any organism, human beings or animals, is like a computer and that it stores all of these different motor patterns, how is it possible to store every single movement that we ever perform in our CNS? It is simply too large of a repertoire of movements to store. There's just simply too many to have an individual motor program for everyone. There is also the issue, the novelty problem in information processing theory. And that is, if we have these stored motor programs, which we then execute when we perform movement, well, how do we ever produce a new movement? How do we come up with something new? So those are two of the main ones. And then I would also, based on my reading, I think that there's also hinted at this idea of a homunculus problem. And homunculus is essentially a word that refers to the little man in your head. And I don't mean that literally, but when we think about the way information processing theory works, we have to ask who is deciding what program to run and how to run it and when to run it. It implies this idea of of executive function that I don't know is particularly helpful in skill acquisition. And that's this image here of, you have essentially in information processing theory, this idea of an executive here in the business suit coming up with the plan, and then the factory workers, which would be the actual end effectors, which would be your muscles, joints, bones, and the things that are actually acting in the world, producing that movement. And I think that that is a problematic way to think about movement. There are some proposed solutions for these problems, which are schema theory and parameterization. So essentially what schema theory proposes is that we don't have a motor program for every possible movement we ever do in life. We have some very broad general motor programs. So an example would be overhead throwing. So that could be applied to baseball, throwing a football, etc. And then what we do is we parameterize, and what that means is we change things like the force and velocity to meet novel demands. And this is also how new movements emerge, that as we parameterize to satisfy changing environmental demands, we also develop new motor programs. It's also important to note that schema theory helps to explain why variable practice is so much more useful than blocked practice. And what I mean by that is, if you imagine, say, practicing tennis. Blocked practice would be doing 10 forehands, 10 backhands, and then 10 serves. Variable practice would be doing a forehand, then a backhand, then a serve, then a backhand, then a forehand in a variable pattern. And schema theory argues that this kind of variable practice helps us develop more robust parameters so that we can better meet changing demands in an unpredictable competitive situation. Next, we move on to one of the big frameworks in motor learning, which is ecological dynamics theory. And ecological dynamics holds that skill is not some stored computer program, but rather it's an emergent behavior that emerges when an organism interacts with its environment. And the concept of self-organization is very important in ecological dynamics theory. It is essentially that we organize ourselves, our various degrees of freedom, and degrees of freedom essentially means all of our different muscles, joints, and ways that we can act on the physical world. We self-organize those around environmental constraints. There's also an emphasis on repetition without repetition, and this picture on the left is very important for understanding that concept. This is a picture that was taken by a Soviet researcher named Nikolai Bernstein, who was performing research on how to improve the efficiency and training of Soviet blacksmiths. And so what he did with this blacksmith was he attached a little light to his wrist and had him perform hammer strokes. And as you notice, that light in this, it's called a cyclogram, traces the pattern of his wrist through various hammer strokes. And what you notice here is that it is not the same pattern every time. He is achieving the same end result. He is striking in the same place, but he is organizing in different ways every single time. And this is what is meant by repetition without repetition. And not to get too deep into this, but Bernstein proposes the idea of motor synergies, which essentially means that we synergize between our shoulder, elbow, and wrist in this example to achieve the same end result, that if the wrist moves a little bit different here, the elbow moves a little bit different there. And that synergy is what allows us to repeat the same outcome without repeating the same motor pattern. This is where we get really into why this kind of theory is important for coaching and for coaching actual athletes. In ecological dynamics theory, we understand that our perception of the environment and our decision making about what to do is completely inseparable from our physical motor skills. We cannot break those two things apart, which is known as decoupling, and work on them in isolation. We can't say, okay, we're just going to work on your technique here and we're going to lose any perception or decision making. Those two things are not separable. And so if we think about it, an action is only skillful if it satisfies dynamic environmental constraints. A given baseball swing is not perfect. It's only perfect if it puts the bat to the ball, and the ball can be delivered at different speeds, different trajectories, different spin rates. And so the action is dependent on what's happening in the environment. And vice versa, our perception of our environment changes our physical motor patterns. That baseball swing, is going to change as we perceive the environment differently. And so, or as we perceive changes in the environment. And so coupling perception and action, or information and movement, is very important in this theory. It's also important to understand, one of the major researchers in this field is James Gibson, who actually was a psychologist studying visual perception. And one of the influences that he has had on motor learning theory is the idea of affordances. And his assertion was that our perception of our environment, specifically our visual perception, is not intended to create an internal representation of the outside world. Distance to an object is essentially meaningless. What we perceive is what action opportunities exist in that environment. So we don't perceive how big something is, how far it is. We observe it or perceive it based on whether or not it is an opportunity to rest, to climb, to pass through, especially, and this is where we get into a really ecological and evolutionary perspective on skill. There is this importance of repetition without repetition, producing similar outcomes, task objectives, without necessarily producing the same motor pattern. And so if we look at this graph, this is from Rob Gray, who's a professor at Arizona State who studies baseball. This has to do with timing parameters in baseball batting. And what's really important here is that this line, the quote unquote good variability, in mathematics, this is known as the manifold. And this is essentially any combination of timing parameters that put the bat to the ball. And what's important is that what Gray found in this study was that after training, baseball players increased their good variability, their variability along the manifold, while decreasing their bad variability or orthogonal variability, essentially timing changes that don't achieve that task objective. So the point here is this idea of functional variability. While traditionally we think of practice as trying to eliminate variability, we think of it as noise and error, what ecological dynamics theory tells us is that variability can be functional. It's actually that we're designed to be highly variable, that it's about structuring that variability in a way that meets task objectives. There's also this idea I mentioned briefly of degrees of freedom. So there's what's known as the degrees of freedom problem proposed by Bernstein, which is essentially when we're developing a skill, we have so many different ways to achieve something, to organize our degrees of freedom. How do we decide what to do? That's one of the fundamental problems. And I'll get a little bit more into the idea of the constraint sled approach here in a minute, but if I told you to walk across the room, you could do that in many different ways. You could crawl, you could jump, you could skip, you could shuffle, you could do whatever. You could organize your degrees of freedom how you choose. And if I added a constraint, say like a play tunnel that like agility dogs run through, that is going to shape your behavior. How you achieve that task is now going to be limited by that constraint. So you're more likely to crawl given that specific constraint. Speaking more broadly here, and this is going to seem like a tangent, but it's very important. Take a second and think about different dynamic systems which can produce complex functional patterns, but which do not have hierarchy or executive control. So some of the examples I would give you here include schools of fish, flocks of birds, various weather patterns. If you think about a water vortex in your sink, the water molecules organize into this stable, it's called an attractor, this stable system, which is also resistant to perturbation. If you flick that vortex with your finger, it will self-organize. So the question is, how do these complex functional patterns occur without any kind of hierarchy or executive input? And this, again, this is bigger than just skill acquisition. This is known as dynamical systems theory, and this is a much broader academic concept, but it again deals with how do these complex systems interact and how do they self-organize. And this can be applied to sports both on an inter-individual level. How do different players on a team or players playing against each other organize? And how does a single individual organize their various degrees of freedom, their hands, their feet, their legs, etc., in order to perform functional movement patterns? And the argument here is that the effectors, and again, an effector is essentially something that's acting on the environment, self-organize through interaction with each other and interaction with the environment. So birds here, again, there is no executive control here. It is simply the various birds interacting with each other and the environment, and the stable pattern emerges from that. And there's a short article by Gordon, 2007, Control Without Hierarchy, from the journal Nature, that is a good read to introduce this relatively complex idea. So having gone on that tangent, what does any of this have to do with getting good at sports? What is important is that when we think of skill as something that emerges from an organism interacting with its environment, it's not some idealized quote unquote motor pattern, because as we've established, there is no single ideal movement pattern. It's highly variable even if we're achieving the same outcome. We then realize that it's the ability to attune to the affordances in our environment and the ability to self-organize around that environment that is what skill really is. And that changes what practice is. Practice is no longer this predictable, rehearsed repetition. It is way more about play, exploration, experimentation, search, and self-organization around constraints. There are a couple of specific practice paradigms that have been proposed within ecological dynamics theory. The first is differential learning. The second is the constraint-led approach. So this is going to get a little sciencey, but it's important to understand. Differential learning is based on the idea of stochastic resonance, which comes from image processing and audio processing. So if we look at this graph on the left here, if the human level of perception is this white line, and this wave below that is a signal. Let's say it's a radio signal. That's below the level of perception. You cannot perceive the signal. But as we add a certain amount of noise, that signal starts to rise to the level of perception. Too much noise and it becomes simply noise, but there is an optimal level of noise. And so what differential learning, and I would encourage you to look some of the practice design up here, is essentially trying to introduce noise and variability into practice intentionally in order to force the athlete to find new movement solutions and find a clear signal, quote unquote, in the noise. And so there's some really good examples of, for example, speed skating starts with a variety of different very strange movement patterns performed prior, and those were found to be more effective than traditional prescriptive instruction. A constraints-led approach is a little bit more something that you might be familiar with. This essentially proposes that our movements are constrained by three different things. By our own individual constraints, whether you're big, small, strong, weak, fast, your own joint segments, etc. Environmental, which this can be things like weather, sociocultural, playing surface, and task, things like the equipment you're playing with, the rules of the game. And the point of the constraints-led approach is that rather than giving prescriptive instruction on what to do, we guide learners to explore new parts of the perceptual motor space through the addition of constraints. So essentially we search, we reorganize, and we repeat this pattern. You can just pause here. This is by Rob Gray from the Perception Action podcast. Really, really excellent work he does there. This summarizes differential learning. This summarizes the constraints-led approach. Again, pause or go to the link if you need more time to look at this. Here's a really good video. So this is an example of changing the rules of tennis to encourage new behavior. So in this game, you'll notice the ball cannot hit on their side. And then when they strike it with their racket, they actually have to hit it on their side first and then direct it to the other the other side of the court. And so what we're doing here is we're encouraging players to think more about strategy and moving their opponent rather than about simply winning with power, because that's simply not possible given these new rules, aka task constraints. And so you get some really interesting movement solutions and behaviors simply by changing the constraints without telling the players what to do. So some life lessons from this. I think it's really important to understand that performance and learning are not the same thing. When we're practicing, we may often fail in order to get better in the future. If all we're doing is using the same stable attractors, the same established movement solutions, that's just like telling me what 2 plus 2 equals 4 over and over and over again. There's no new learning going on. The learning is happening when we're experimenting and searching, and sometimes there's failure involved. And it's important for athletes, parents, and administrators to understand why that's occurring in practices, because it's very uncomfortable, but it is with a purpose, and it's important that coaches can explain that. Using interleaving and spaced repetition, regardless of what you're trying to learn. Variable practice, rather than just repeating the same flashcard over and over, the same quiz question over and over, putting some space in between your repetitions and then having some variable repetitions will enhance your learning. And then whatever the thing you're trying to learn, your design of your practice environment should closely mirror your performance environment, but it should be simplified rather than broken up into tiny pieces. So some other life lessons here. It's important to sort of rethink what a coach or teacher is. You're not here as a giver of information based on all of everything we've discussed here. You're not just putting information into athletes or helping them, establish the mythical ideal movement pattern. It's better to think of yourself as someone who's creating an environment. So an architect is one analogy. I also like the idea of a gardener. A gardener can't make plants grow. A gardener is there to provide the right conditions. And so as a coach, it's important to say, what kind of environment am I providing my athletes with? Am I providing them with a rich, task representative environment in which they can learn and grow, or am I providing them with a barren, stark one? But again, at the end of the day, they're the ones who grow. You are simply there to provide the environment. This idea of perception action coupling brings up the importance of a games-based learning design, and there are a variety of different games-based approaches. There's in PE, there's what's known as teaching games for understanding, which is similar. In my opinion, it separates the idea of decision-making and skill too much, whereas as we've established, those things are very interdependent. But it's important when we're training skills, we need to find some way to make the practice game-like. There needs to be some kind of competition, and there needs to be some kind of outcome that is dependent on the decisions athletes make rather than simply going around cones because a coach told them to. This also brings up the idea of maintaining information movement coupling. Any movements that athletes are doing in practice should be based on something they're perceiving in their environment other than a coach just telling them to do it. We also want to try to promote an external attentional focus. We just don't have the time to go too deep into this, but the researcher Gabrielle Wolf, WULF, has done a lot of work in this area. And just to summarize, essentially, when we help our athletes focus on their effect on the external world rather than their own internal biomechanics, we improve learning and performance. As I mentioned with games-based learning and design, emotionally salient activities. When movement is joyful, playful, or even when there is perhaps anger, disappointment, sadness from losing, when there is emotion involved, learning sticks. When you're moving around cones, there's not a lot of emotion involved. So finding ways to bring emotion in is actually very important for skill acquisition. And then this idea of contextual interference, again, if you're practicing, like I said, tennis strokes, or if I were to use an example of a pilot, rather than simply practicing in a flight simulator, takeoff, 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 landing, 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 performing variable skills is actually going to produce better retention and transfer to the actual performance environment, i.e. flying a plane. So that would look like performing takeoff, various turning maneuvers, and then landing rather than blocking those out. Here's another good video of the constraint sled approach. So in this video, a baseball pitcher is using what's known as a connection ball, and he has to hold it against his rib cage while throwing, and his goal, his task objective, is to make sure that that connection ball moves forward after the throw. This is meant to help with an issue in baseball known as elbow flyout. And again, we're not giving the athlete prescriptive instruction here. We're having him focus on his attention externally, i.e. the ball, and providing a constraint that he has to self-organize around, and that helps him find a more optimal movement solution. So that is manipulation of constraints over prescriptive instruction. We also want this idea of task simplification. So that an example of that would be playing with a smaller tennis racket and less bouncy balls for youth tennis players, rather than breaking the swing down into piece by piece by piece, because it's been found that that kind of part training or task decomposition is less likely to transfer to performance, especially variable, continuous, dynamic performance environments like tennis. And we want a learner-centered, i.e. what the learners need, environment, rather than a coach-centered environment. Coach-centered being providing what the coach needs to teach or wants to teach, rather than what the learners need to learn. So again, as I mentioned, scaling equipment. There's some other really interesting research on that. Niemann's 2019 examined using light blue hockey pucks. Those were originally designed for youth hockey players because it's easier for them to lift it because they're lighter. But it's actually, even in beginner adults, a better choice. Tarakia 2021, and that's in the references, did a really interesting study where they had a basketball hoop that could change in both width and height to provide an optimal level of challenge to players. And again, that may not be realistic for the average coach, but providing learners with, say, a shorter basket and a smaller basketball, equipment that is scaled to them, is highly important for skill acquisition. Limiting our feedback is important to only when learners ask for it. This again gets to the idea of contextual interference and variable practice, rather than just giving them immediate feedback, which tends to actually inhibit learning. There's a few really interesting things that, again, we don't have a ton of time for, but rather than correcting errors, asking learners to amplify errors, and then they themselves find the right solution by doing that. So if a golfer is too much on their front foot, telling them to go completely on their front foot would be an example of error amplification. And additionally, there's some really interesting research, and this is in my larger references, that positive social comparative feedback, i.e. telling learners that they are better than their peers, even when they're not, essentially giving them bogus positive feedback, enhances motor learning. That is so, because when they feel good, they want to practice more. They feel better about themselves, they practice more. So that is a coaching practice that is actually very evidence-based. Essentially giving players bogus positive feedback judiciously is beneficial for motor learning. Consider, how is your environment influencing your players' behavior? So a simple example of that is cones. You don't play hockey, basketball, soccer against cones, yet we spend a lot of time running around them. Well, as a hockey coach, if I want my players to keep their heads up, why would I have them skate around cones, which are going to encourage them to keep their head down? So that is a way in which the environmental constraint is actually producing a suboptimal movement pattern. I would say cones can be useful for, if we're playing a tag game, to define the space, they're useful, but having players simply move around cones the way they would an opponent, have them use an opponent rather than a cone. And so for a constraint, let's say we want to encourage players to keep their head up. In ice hockey, rather than having players perhaps wear jerseys in a small area game, using tape on the helmets to define what team they're on, because now they have to keep their head up and scan the ice with their eyes in order to see who's on their team and who isn't. Simply by manipulating that constraint in their environment, I've now changed their behavior. Some hurdles that I had with this project, as you can see on the length of this presentation, I'm sorry for the length, it is a massive subject. I've barely brushed the surface in this presentation, and I was really barely able to brush the surface with my reading over the course of this term. It's just simply too big. So what to leave in and what to leave out is really challenging. I've tried a little bit in the design of the course itself to do things like interleaving and representative assignments that students would actually do as coaches. So asking myself, I'm learning all this, how can I apply it to the actual curriculum design? And then finally, and this gets back to point one, motor learning and sport pedagogy are related, but they're somewhat separate disciplines. Sport pedagogy has more to do with pedagogical principles, coaching science, coaching practice, coach development, whereas motor learning is more the science behind how people acquire motor skills. Very related, but it's possible that in an actual university, it should be motor learning is one course and sport pedagogy is another. Few suggested readings here. Rob Gray of Arizona State produces the Perception Action podcast. Excellent. And his YouTube channel is also excellent for review of studies. His book, How We Learn to Move, I would argue could be better proofread. There are actually too many typographical errors in it for someone with a PhD and a university professor, but it's a very good introduction. Luis Uehara is a really good researcher in the idea of sociocultural constraints. So he's looked into how like Brazilian culture influences soccer skill. Keith Davids is very important in the constraints-led approach, which was initially proposed by Carl Newell, but Keith Davids has really taken that has really performed a lot of research on that recently. So I would look at some of these, and as I mentioned, Gabrielle Wolf on attention as well. Here's images and references, and thank you for your time and attention.